Well, hello and welcome. I'm Stacy Martin with Keller Williams Realty, and this evening we have the pleasure of having Ed Martin with us. Welcome, Ed.
Hi, pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome. Ed is an experienced commercial broker that has a CCIM, and that's a certified commercial investment member. He's got a lot of experience, and this designation is a highly respected premier professional designation in the community for for commercial real estate. So, Ed, take it away.
Yes, no, thank you. Yeah, the CCIM is something that distinguishes you from other commercial agents and brokers. It allows me to perform a more detailed analysis on a piece of property or on a case. And really, that serves my clients by having the ability to go a lot deeper or as deep as needed for a specific situation.
Right. Tell us what makes a commercial property commercial. Why
That's a great question. I actually lead with this question a lot because it's not always that clear. But the easiest way to distinguish whether something is commercial as opposed to residential is the primary purpose of the real estate for someone to make money. Now, we could get into specifics like, what is the zoning of the property? Does that classify as commercial? But you could find exceptions. Or what is the lending for it? But you could find exceptions. Typically, a confusing asset type for commercial and residential would be multifamily. And the way the lending community looks at that is if it's four or fewer units, they classify that as a residential investment loan. But if it's five or more units, the lending community classifies it as a commercial investment loan. But for the most part, you could take that dividing line of is the reason this property is here if it's for someone to make money, and you could call it commercial.
Right. Well, commercial transactions have a significantly longer lead time compared to residential. So what can you share with us today to help manage expectations and reduce anxiety for clients?
Yeah. So I think it is very important to set expectations at the beginning. So an ounce of expectation settings can lead to a pound of outcomes, right? Because it does take a lot longer and there's a lot more room for interruption or for cancellation. I do spend a lot of time on the front end talking about that. Most people are familiar with residential. They're familiar with Redfin and Showing Time and Zillow and with a lot of change to the data. And so I spend a lot of time making that distinction if they've never transacted in commercial before about what's different. First of all, our data is not as clean, is not in one system, and it is not regulated. So therefore, there could be a degree of inaccuracy to it. Second thing is we don't have standard forms because actually most commercial brokers are not realtors, meaning they don't join the association. Lots of time people confuse the word realtor with real estate agent. Well, they don't, it's not congruent. You have to join the association to get the realtor designation. And then once you join the association, you can then subscribe to be a member of the MLS, which of course is the one source of authority for residential data. Commercial data is all over the map, doesn't change much. It could take us a while. I have had transactions that have taken 3 years or cases that have taken 3 years to fully transact. So I like to make sure I spend a lot of time consulting with my clients about what that duration could end up being. And so I get into the dialogue early on about is this a time sensitive search or sale that we're doing so I can get to the heart of what their expectations are and either adjust my profile of where we price or what we do or adjust their expectations.
Well, good. Well, tell us some of the specific due diligence hurdles often overlooked and how you would simplify that complexity for clients early on, such as the process and making it manageable for them.
Yeah, so I do like to have an interactive conversation as an introduction early on. And so a conversation like this, where Stacy, hypothetically, you'd be my client. And so I would talk to you about what type of asset are we looking at? So I get asked a lot, how is the commercial real estate market? And I say it depends upon the asset type and the zip code. So in residential, you have one use for a property to dwell in it, right? In commercial, the use is going to vary by the asset type. So we have five major asset types. We have office, retail, industrial, multifamily for one's 5 units or more, and then we have specialty. And specialty is a broader range that we can get into granular things like churches or event venues or car washes or self-storage, right? So I like to explain based on what asset type we're looking at, what might be things we need to think about, whether it's parking. A lot of times there could be rules on how much parking is allowed for that use in a specific property. Or it could be, are they storing hazmat or flammable materials in the unit? And we want to make sure that we go with properties that are going to permit that zoning wise, but then also permit it within the building that we're in. So those are common types of things that are often overlooked. And so I like to spend a lot of time at the beginning, making sure they understand, much like a doctor explains, this is the operation we're going to go through. I like to give a broad overview early on and then break it up into manageable chunks.
Tell us about the competitiveness in commercial. I hear it can be competitive. So what system do you use to help your client win when purchasing commercial property? What's different about it?
So we usually break up our proposal and offer process into two main phases. And so a common term we use in commercial is called an LOI, or letter of intent document. And one of the main reasons we break it up into two phases is there's a lot more interaction with attorneys doing contract drafting and reviews in commercial real estate than there is in residential. And as you know, attorneys charge by the hour. The meter's running. I kind of view what we do as commercial brokers as a little bit of free help, if you will. And so the LOI phase allows us to take advantage of some of that free help, where we want to come to agreement in principle on the key real estate transaction terms before we go to contract or before we go to lease, and engage the attorneys in what I like to call contract or lease air hockey, where they're going back and forth negotiating legal terminology. Remember, as commercial real estate agents, just like in residential, we do not lawyer. We cannot practice law. We can advise, but we have to engage an attorney, and even more so in commercial because we're usually not using standard forms that have been written by an NAR or a local association attorney. The letter of intent, when I use that and I explain it, sometimes I might have a buyer or a tenant that is hesitant to get too concrete about their terms. And I'll say, well, the letter of intent is non-binding. Okay, so this is a soft commitment. We're proposing some terms to them. I like to say we're asking them out on a date when we do a letter of intent. We're not getting married yet. We're saying, hey, we'd like to go out on a date, and these are the place. This is the place we want to go. This is the budget we have. This is the time we want to take on the date. And so we want to kind of want to hammer all that out. And then once we agree to terms in the letter of intent and we go to start working on the contract, well, we're engaged. Okay. We can still break off the engagement, right? We're not bound yet. And then once we've actually agreed to terms on the contract, well, now we're married. Okay. Now you could still get the marriage annulled. That's what we call the contingency period on the contract, where if we've written in enough time to be able to cancel the contract, we can cancel without penalty. But once that contingency period and all the contingencies expire, now it's going to be a costly divorce. So it's date, engagement, early marriage, and then once you're married, you're committed. And so I kind of
Right.
explain it in levels of commitment.
Right. Well, speaking of that, what would be three non-negotiable items that you would include to protect your client's interests to make
Yeah. So
sure
there,
that they had, the right protection as you're going through those phases?
no, great question. So they do vary from case to case. There are two things that when we talk about leasing that I like to make sure are included. One, I want to have a general clause in the LOI that carries forward to the lease that says if there is any reason the municipality will now permit my client to occupy the space, that the lease is cancelable by either party and the deposit and prepaid rent are fully refundable. And I'll push really hard for that because most leases do not include that language. Something else I like to add is if there are any things you have not disclosed that will materially disrupt my client's ability to occupy and use the space, I want to make sure that there's some form of recourse for my client on that as well. Okay. The third one, I will adapt. Like when we're in negotiations, I like to make the third non-negotiable more the client's non-negotiable. And so I will ask questions like price, tenant improvement allowance, length of lease. What's most important to you? Because we're not going to get everything we want. This is about an exchange of concessions, right? We're on a seesaw when we're negotiating with the other party. And at the beginning, our seat's on the ground and the other side's up here. And so we're trying to find the right balance that keeps both people equally tolerant or tolerable of the terms that we agree to.
Right. So when someone's buying, uh, we get this a lot. What is the cap rate? And can you explain what that means and maybe
Yeah,
a simplified financial calculation to kind of help us
yeah,
decide if a property is worth it or not?
yep. So cap rate is used two ways for purchases. One, for an investor to determine whether the investment opportunity has enough return for them. Okay. Cap rate is a very simple calculation. It's taking the net operating income for the preceding 12 months and dividing it by the acquisition price. That's cap rate. Okay. That's if you're an investor. Another way it is used is also in valuations. So in residential, when an appraisal is done, they primarily use the comps sold method in determining the value of the subject or the property that they're looking to put a value on. And they'll take those comps and they'll adjust them based on things they have or don't have over the subject when they compare it. In commercial, of course, appraisers will use the comp sold method, but if it's a asset that has some tenants in there that are paying rent, i.e., it's an income producing asset, they will use the cap rate or the income valuation method to value the asset as well. And so when I mentioned earlier about how uh, that the commercial economics depend on asset type and zip code. Well, cap rate is a reflection of that. So sometimes the cap rate for office in Tyson's might be lower than it is for office in Warrenton, for example, because Warrenton's got lower valued properties and Tyson's has higher valued properties. Okay. And so tool we use called CoStar keeps a nice finger on the pulse of what cap rates are between different submarkets in Northern Virginia.
All right. Well, speaking of cap rates, there's a lot of acronyms and things in the commercial real estate business that are different from what people have heard of before, like triple net and CAM and TI allowances and things like that. How do you explain these complex concepts to a first-time buyer or an investor?
Yeah. So triple net allowances at CAM are kind of all together go together with a first-time tenant. And so when I describe how rents are advertised in commercial real estate, they're described as cost per square foot per year is the base rent. And so if we want to get at what the monthly asking base rent is, we want to take the square footage and multiply it by the rate that's advertised and then divide it by 12 to come up with the monthly base rent. However, there's usually a suffix on the end of that base rent, and that suffix tells us what is or isn't included in the base rent. So specifically, if it could be triple net is a common word, or it could be full service, or it could be points in between. Triple net means it is a stripped down base rent. Nothing extra is included in it. And a triple net lease is very common for multi-tenant buildings. What that means is this base rent is net of the taxes, the insurance, and the common area maintenance, or CAM, which is another acronym you mentioned. And so it's important to understand that that's actually beneficial to the tenant. A lot of first-time tenants panic. They go, "You mean I got to pay more rent?" I'm like, "Well, No, it's not more rent. These are your pass-throughs. And the reason why most tenants end up liking or preferring triple net in the long run is it's a much more transparent and equitable way to approach a lease. So a lease that is not triple net, that may have these add-ons included in the rent, may also be marked up. Or there might be annual escalations to the rent, very common in commercial leases, that are marking up stuff that probably shouldn't be marked up. Because in the case of property taxes, property insurance, and CAM, or common area maintenance, those truly don't change that much. You think about it, how often do property taxes and insurance change? Well, usually only when there's a valuation adjustment done by the county or the municipality. How often does CAM change? Well, if we have a really snowy winter, or we have a really dry summer, or maybe the parking lot needs a lot of service done to it in a specific year, that might make the CAM adjust higher. And so those kind of are what they are. And another thing we use when we talk about triple nets is we call them the pass-throughs. They pass them through to the tenants based on each tenant's pro rata share of the overall square footage. So it's very important to a tenant. Now, why landlords like triple net is if they want to sell the asset and they have a suite of triple net tenants in the property, well, an investor that wants to buy it knows exactly what their cash is when they make the purchase because it's triple net leases. So triple net has kind of evolved in multi-tenant buildings as seen as a much more transparent way to handle things. Now, I mentioned triple net. The other extreme you heard me briefly mention was full service. Full service leases are grossed up to where even the utilities are included in the rent. What's funny is the amount of tenants I will run into that are early in their process that really want one bill, full service rent, until they start to realize that they don't really know what's going into that bill because it's not broken up. It's not transparent, right?
Well,
And they might
especially
be
something
paying for
like,
somebody else's water, for
I was just gonna
example.
say, something like water where you don't use it, but you're paying for everybody else to run it all day long, let's say. So,
Right. Yeah. If you're
yeah,
running a real estate office and a building full of doctors and everything's included in the bill, well, I'm guessing those doctors are using a lot more water than the real estate office is, but you're paying for it, right?
right, right. Well, commercial has its pitfalls. What should your clients look out for? What should they be aware of?
Well, back in the first Gulf War, the Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld was famous for saying, we've got to look out for the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. And I think of that word unknown unknowns when I think about commercial real estate. In the residential world, so much is got guardrails on it that's been set up to help protect the public, the consumer, the agent, the lender, everything, and even attorneys have guardrails on them. In commercial, it is wild, wild west. You're like a cowboy and you're trying to watch out for what you don't know is coming around the corner. So there's a lot more room for error. There's a lot more room for risk. Virginia is a buyer beware state, and you should definitely make sure you're explaining that to your client over and over again. There are so many things you could run into that you just aren't expecting.
Right,
As the broker, you take great pride in trying to prepare them for the journey as much as you can, but you can't control everything.
right. So let's talk about an example. Let's say you have a small company and you need to expand a home-based business. You haven't had space yet, and now you need that commercial space. And let's say we're going to use it Monday through Friday. And we're looking in Prince William County. We need some storage. We have a few employees. Maybe we need some parking spots. Can you show us some live data and other
Yeah.
questions you might ask them if they were getting prepared? So anybody who's watching this now or later, let's say you're looking for space yourself, these are some questions that you probably need to be thinking of what your answers are, because when you hire someone like Ed to show you, and he does the search for you, or the other individual does a search for you, you're going to have to, it's just like when you buy a house, you have to start off with like, where do we want to live? How much are we looking to spend? What other things do we need? Do we need a yard, or are we looking for a condo? So just basic stuff like that. Have your list ready of, kind of what your needs are and what you would be
Okay.
conveying.
So let's talk about what I've just shared here. So this is CoStar. And I almost always start my search consultations with CoStar on the screen for a couple reasons. One, as I mentioned earlier, we don't really use the MLS. Only about 5% of my transactions come through the MLS. CoStar, which we're looking at, is a private, you got to be a paying member of it to join it, search and data analysis portal that is put on by its parent company, which is also called CoStar. CoStar kind of cut their teeth providing data and analytics years ago to appraisers, lenders, property owners, and real estate brokers. And we had all these real estate brokers paying for subscriptions so they could gain knowledge and insight into commercial real estate because they had access to CoStar's analytical tools. And then CoStar got a bright idea and they said, hey, we've got all these brokers. Why don't we let them advertise listings to each other? And so they started to allow that to happen. But of course, this system is closed. The public can't get to CoStar. And so they started to see that there were these other public search portals that were coming up. A more common one out there is called LoopNet. And CoStar said, we're going to buy LoopNet. And so you notice this blue pentagon, CoStar. Well, the LoopNet pentagon is red. And then CoStar has slowly been buying other asset-specific search portals like homes.com, you might have heard of. It's an orange pentagon. They also own land.com, a green pentagon. They own apartments.com. Don't ask me what the color is. But they also own BizBuySell. And so that's their empire they're trying to build, but with CoStar being the back-end engine and analytics of data. So I start my search here. And so in the scenario you're talking about, Stacy, a couple of them have employees, they need a little storage, they need a little office. That's kind of a hybrid asset type that we call flex in the commercial space. So you'll notice, remember those asset types I talked about earlier, office, industrial, retail. They've got flex and medical. Medical is its own specific subset of office. And so I add flex and I picked for lease. And each blue pin you see on this map is a advertised lease option that is flex for the portion of the map we're looking at. To keep our map specific, I'm going to take this 4-mile radius, and that's it. Okay. And you're going to notice that flex asset types look like a row of a bunch of garages in one building. Okay. And so what I start to do is I consult with you is I say, okay, how much square footage do we think we need? So sometimes the prospective tenant has an idea that, I think I want 1,500 square feet. And so I'll take a range of like 1,000 to 2,000. So we get things that are a little bit smaller and a little bit bigger and get them included. Because what we learned over time is most tenants' idea of what they think they need is flexible. And it's usually adjusted by what the budget allocation is and what the actual asking rent is. Commercial rents are usually directly based on commercial property values. It's a little secret. Commercial rents are going to be higher in Tysons and they're going to be in Warrenton. It's just because the property values are higher in Tysons than they are in Warrenton. Is that fair? Maybe not. But the theory is if you're renting space in Tysons, you're probably having an opportunity to make more money off using that space when you lease it than you are in Warrenton. So it pretty much correlates. So when I set that range of 1,000 to 2,000, one asset here comes up very close to 66 and 234. And this is over in Build America behind the Burger King off of 234. You can see a lot of these from I-66 as you're driving. And that's probably the main attraction to them, other than they're relatively inexpensive compared to other lease assets in that area. As I'm waiting for CoStar to bring this up, I'll describe to you what I say to tenants regularly. The lease is a loan. The owner has an asset, and they're loaning you the asset for the period of time that is the lease term. And your rent payments are your loan payments. And so the way an owner thinks is the worst thing they could do is go ahead and get you under lease and have you fail. So most of them would rather wait for the right tenant before they take a chance on what they perceive to be someone they might regret. Okay. They'd rather have their space sit empty. So in this case, we're going to talk about some terms. We've got an asset that you could buy, you could lease one bay for 1,700 square feet or two side by side up to 3,400 square feet. So when we click on this, we're going to see some terminology we talked about. This is a triple net lease. Remember, I talked about that earlier. Okay. So the rent of $17 a foot is the base rent per year, square foot per year. And so we take that $17, and we multiply that by 1,700 in a scenario where we're only looking at one bay. And that gives us an annual base rent of $28,900. We divide that by 12, and that gives us a monthly base rent of $2,408. You notice that they did the math for us there, 2,408. And the next thing you see is this broker from Busalis has done us one more solid favor. They've already given us the triple net rate. So if they hadn't done this, one of my early questions to Melanie or George or Tom, who have this listed, is, and I would say, hey, Melanie, George, or Tom, I'm calling about your listing on Nathan Court for my client. They're a home-based business looking to expand into brick and mortar that they rent. What are your triple nets running? Because remember what I said earlier, triple nets are the true expenses for that asset. And so they'll usually come back with $1 per foot per year rate. So in this case, if we took the scenario of 1,700, we take $4.35 times 1,700 and we divide it by 12, and that gives us the triple net rate of $616 and a quarter. Now, if the tenant wants to know, well, what does that mean? And I would say, okay, well, if we add that 616 and a quarter to the 2,408 base rent that we had here, that means $3,024.25 plus you pay your own utilities. Okay. But keeping in mind that the only part of that rent that's subject to annual escalations is going to be the base rent. So that's what I would describe. Now, some key things I would look for in a property like this is what is the clear height? So Stacy, as you mentioned, they need some storage. Well, so I see here the ceiling height is 15 feet. Okay. I'd say, is that going to meet your needs? How high are you going to need to stack supplies and materials in the storage area? Then I'll say something like, how much parking do you need? So CoStar keeps track of parking ratio. And so when it's a multi-tenant building, that's exactly how they'll measure it. So in a scenario where we're renting 1,700 square feet, we take 1.7, because remember it's per 1,000, and we multiply that by 3.06. And that tells us that this space is equipped for a little bit over 5 parking spots. So if that's not going to meet their needs, we might want to suggest they do 2 bays rather than 1 so that they can get 10 and a half parking spots. All right. And then the next thing I look for is how deep is the building? It tells us it's 60 feet deep. I'll also look for, is there a drive-in or a dock? Meaning a drive-in door like a garage door, or a dock, a roll-up door that you can back a truck up to and then unload flat to it, okay? In this case, they're not telling us either a drive-in or a dock, so I'd go back to the lease listing and see if they have any notes. And they don't. So the unfortunate consequence of having inaccurate or unreliable data is we also get inconsistent listings. You guys don't know how good you have it. You got rules on making sure the listings are populated and accurate and that the pictures are governed. The picture is telling me that this is probably a drive-in, and that's good. And it looks to be probably a 12-foot high door too, which is good as well. And that's the inside of the storage. Now, let's talk about a couple things here. When I look at this, it's in pretty rough shape, right? This isn't exactly what I'd call a glistening office. You've got a big storage area. Looks like we might have a bathroom, and looks like we have a little bit of showroom. Okay. That's our office. So what I see is they have drop ceiling. Drop ceiling is important in office because it minimizes the amount of space you have to climate control. It basically builds a box within the box that you can put air conditioning and heat, and you can manage your utility bills. You probably don't want to heat or cool that big 15-foot high warehouse. You just want to heat and cool the area a certain way that you want to heat and cool. Now, you do see occasionally a warehouse heater to keep the warehouse somewhat climate controlled in the winter months. So a warehouse today would be miserable to work out of unless you had some kind of heater in there. So anyway, that gives you an idea of the kinds of things I would talk about in doing a search for a commercial tenant with those specs you mentioned.
Perfect. Well, we really enjoyed our time with you today, Ed, and we hope that for everybody who's watching or will watch later, that we gave you some perspective on what to keep in mind and how you need to be informed with decisions about commercial real estate. And Ed, do you want to tell people how they can get in touch with you if they're looking to buy, sell, lease, what have you, within commercial real estate?
Yes, the best way to get in touch with me is my email address, which is ed@Martin Commercial Partners. Okay. I think there's a couple questions in the chat. Would you like me to address those?
Sure, I didn't see the chat.
That's okay. So the first question I see is there an addendum for that? Is every contract unique? So most contracts are unique. So we do have the opportunity from time to time to use the NAR associated commercial contract. So I'm a member of NVAR, unlike many of my colleagues, which means I'm also a member of VAR. And we do have a fill in the blank contract. It is a very bare bones contract. I will usually only lead with that when I have a client that's very concerned about their legal costs and is really looking to conserve time and energy and money on making the offer. And typically, if it's using the fill in the blank contract, since I am a realtor, I'm authorized to fill in the blanks on that association contract. Now, if it is a handwritten contract, meaning from scratch, written by an attorney, I do not practice law. The client's attorney has to write that contract. Okay. Looks like another question I got was, do you use the cost approach for commercial? Yes. Usually, an appraiser or a commercial broker will use the cost to replace if the other two methods are not available or reliable, because that's the hardest one to do. Because usually you have to factor in things like depreciation, like how long has that space been there? We can't value it based on the cost of today's materials to build it exactly like it is, given the condition it's in. So we're usually backing off some kind of depreciation expense for that method as well. Because if we valued it based on the cost of today's materials, it would be overvalued. So, all right. That's all the questions I have in the chat. Ed@Martin Commercial Partners, the best way to find me,
And your phone number.
703-867-3350. I look forward to advising or helping you or anyone you know.
Well, thanks, Ed, again for joining us. And to everyone out there, have a great evening. Thanks for
Thank
joining
you.
us.
My pleasure.